So the first panel we will have today, as I said, is Gun Violence 101. This particular panel is going to focus on why. It's going to focus on the why, and it's going to focus on the what. And so again, what lands us in this space today, speaking about gun violence, this first panel, we really want to dive deep on why are we having a conversation about gun violence and mass shootings, and why are we actually taking the time to talk about solutions? So breaking down data and looking at prevalence and what happens where and kind of painting a picture as to why the nation and the city of Annapolis has to have a conversation about gun violence. Okay, we're going to begin this panel by having each panelist say a few things about why they land on this panel and how their work intersects with our conversation about gun violence. I'm going to begin over here with Dr. Ellie Gomez.
Wow. So I went from stand-in to start. That's so. Let me say that this issue is daunting. It's a very broad issue. There is a lot at its core. It seems like a simple equation. It certainly is not. It's much more complicated. It affects all aspects of our the way that we live in our society. So I want to start off by thanking Will and Mayor Gavin for inviting a diverse panel of voices, because I think that is an essential part of what we're trying to do, is ensure that all voices are heard. And we have a lot of talent in this city and in this county, and unfortunately, often not everyone's invited to into the conversation. So I think that's changed quite a bit since Mayor Gavin took office, and I appreciate that. So my first comment that I'm reminding myself here is regards fear. And I want to make sure that we appreciate how much this has changed the dynamic in what we are seeing over the last 40 years in terms of gun violence. 40, 50 years ago, the NRA was nowhere near as nefarious in that it was defending the right to have rifles for the purpose of hunting, and was ensuring safety and responsibility in gun ownership. And the conversation was slowly taken over by fear, and we went from the idea of hunting animals for sport to feeling empowered to shoot another human being in the interest or in defense of our right to protect ourselves. And I'd like to make clear that fear is really a big part of this sad crisis that we're living. Yes, sir? Okay, so I'll leave it there and pass it on to my colleagues. There is a lot more to say with regard to prevention and the like, but I'm going to move on and just we'll have that as our starting point.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Danielle Smith. I'm here representing Black Women for Positive Change. We're a global international organization comprised of African American women, and we also have what we call Good Brothers. We partner with a lot of different organizations throughout the world, throughout the country. We have something what we call a week of nonviolence, usually around the second and third week of October. And it's based around focusing on how to change the culture of violence, how to change the mindset. A lot of things that individuals are dealing with violence, it deals with mental health, it deals with a lot of the issues that they're going through. And we're at a state right now where our children are scared to go to schools, and instead of going to school to learn, they're dealing with drills. I have a 9-year-old granddaughter, and she talks to me about how they practice of how to, get away when there's something going on as far as there could be an attack. So we have to also look at the primary issue. And so we want to focus on how to change that culture and how to do the different mindset, believing that we need social workers and mental health workers to look at the origin of the problem and the issue. And thank you, Will and Mayor Gavin, for having me here to talk about some of these issues.
Good morning. My name is Leah Sakala, and I'm a researcher at the Urban Institute in the Justice Policy Center. I thank you all so much for being here, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this important discussion. I've been asked to sit on this panel today because a lot of my work looks at the importance of centering communities in designing public safety solutions. The research is really clear that people who are proximate to public safety challenges, people who are part of the communities where concerns like gun violence are occurring, are essential stakeholders in not only really pinpointing the problem, identifying what exactly is wrong, what exactly needs to be changed, but also co-designing solutions. My research focuses on the way that this happens all over the country. We know everything from, for example, moms in Chicago organizing themselves on their own blocks to reduce violence in their neighborhoods, to clergy in Boston organizing walks at night to get in touch with folks who are directly in the same social networks as people who are both at high risk of being victimized and perpetrating violence. And really collaborative solutions where communities and community groups and government agencies work together all over the country to co-design solutions. And then the second piece of this is, of course, making sure that our public safety budgets, at the heart of things, public budgets are moral documents that really express where our priorities exist as a society, really reflect a comprehensive approach to public safety solutions. And so ensuring that in addition to funding corrections and law enforcement, that resources that come from our taxpayer dollars also flow to other essential public stakeholders, public safety stakeholders in the community, like service providers, mental health providers, and really the foundation, the organizations that form the bedrock of our communities and help bring people together. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm really excited for the discussion. Thank you.
My name is Paul Herman. I'm the major of the Annapolis Police Department. I'm currently the acting chief. I want to thank the mayor and his staff for putting this on. This is fantastic. Thanks. My role in all this, I think, is probably pretty clear and to everybody here. But my role in the panel would be to think of the panel as sort of a Greek chorus, where we all bring a different perspective, a different tool that we can bring to bear on a particular problem. The tool that I bring to bear is, as I see it, fundamentally one about assigning a culpability, assigning who did what, moral agency, if you will, the idea of holding people accountable for what they've done. While we focus on the tools that we use to achieve a particular outcome, I see my role as anchoring it all into that. Ultimately, people have to be held accountable for what they do, and that's my job, and that's my role, and that'll be my voice in the panel. Thank you.
Hi. My name's Ari Davis. I'm a public health fellow at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence in DC. And so what we do is we advocate and develop policies based on the research to reduce gun violence in all of its forms. And we work both at the federal level, at the state level, and we as well as at the local level. So I'm here to provide the public health perspective on how to address gun violence using a public health approach. So the first step when we're talking about public health is looking at the data to kind of inform what the problem is. So I just wanted to provide a couple brief numbers so that you can get a sense of what gun violence looks like in the US and then in Maryland. So in 2017, almost 40,000 individuals lost their lives by guns. 63% around are actually firearm suicides, which is rarely talked about, and it needs to be talked about a little bit more. And about a third, 35% are firearm homicides. But when we look at Maryland, I was pulling the data yesterday, and I was surprised. It's actually flipped. So you have majority of homicides, 61%, and less suicides. And so I found that interesting that that there's a difference between kind of the national statistics and what's happening in Maryland, and I'd love to talk more about that when we have this discussion.
Good morning. My name is Tony Crosby. I am the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Baltimore Field Division for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. My role, I've been with ATF for almost 20 years. I did 14 years as a street agent within Baltimore City. And now I am back in Baltimore City in a managerial position. So I think my role in this panel is to discuss, like our acting chief said here, how we look to combat violent crime by holding those accountable that committed the violent crime. And from a federal perspective, how we partnership with the state and local agencies, such as Annapolis City, Baltimore City, and the other agencies around the state of Maryland, and we also cover the state of Delaware. And then from a nationwide perspective, from ATF, some of the things that we are putting in place to try to combat the violent crime across the country.
So thank you all very much. So I want to dive right into some questions. I do want to let you all know as an audience, a large part of this is you all being able to ask the questions that you need to ask of the panelists. So feel free at any point to raise your hand. It's incredibly interactive, and I encourage you all to please ask your questions, and also remember in terms of affinities and who they represent and kind of their their area of expertise. So we want to be sure we're asking them questions they can knowledgeably answer. So the first question, which is macro, I mean it's huge, but I think it frames it, which is, why are we talking about gun violence in June 2019? Why are we talking about gun violence? You have a microphone.
Hello. Hello? Okay, first of all, I want to say one of the reasons why I think we're talking about gun violence because our country has become so desensitized to gun violence. It just happens and it goes on. And like I mentioned before, our kids are, they're worried about it. It's crazy that you have 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds going to school and they're scared to go to school, or they're scared to walk out in their neighborhoods and, just play because of what's going on with gun violence, as far as with the gangs, with the parents having guns and setting the guns around their homes and not, having them locked up and stuff like that. So what the main thing I wanted to say with us, we have something called, I mentioned before, the Week of Nonviolence, which started in D.C. in 2012. After the tragedy of Trayvon Martin and so many other police shootings, including Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, etc., plus gang shootings and neighborhoods and domestic violence, sponsored by Black Women for Positive Change. Our Positive Change Foundation, we partner with honorary co-chairs such as Eric Holder, Congresswoman Gwen Moore, and with her, we're also working on something called de-escalation. And with the de-escalation bill that we're working on with Congresswoman Gwen Moore, it has to do with training community leaders. So what we want to do is to train the community leaders and ordinary Americans in effective and evidence-based de-escalation techniques in order to ensure that individuals at a diverse levels of the society have retained greater skills to resolve conflicts, manage anger, and control implicit bias without the use of physical force. A lot of times there are triggers that happen. So you have young people and they get into something. You notice sometimes if you're older, you tell your kids something, they might not listen, whereas opposed to they'll listen to someone closer to their age. And so sometimes when the police officers come up to them and they say something, that triggers them to act a certain way. So what we want to do is train the rec centers, all of the community areas, the nurses, the emergency rooms, because they're dealing with a lot of violence. So basically the whole main thing that we want to do is change the culture of violence, change the mindset, and equip people with things that they can do to help de-escalate situations.
Thank you so much. So I want to also, I want to also ask a question that comes from some of the things that you just talked about, which is a culture of violence. So again, so we're here speaking about gun violence. Can someone speak to the culture of violence in the United States of America and how that contributes to gun violence? So some things that lead to us having to speak about gun violence. Is it just gun violence, or is it?
There we go. The one of the primary things that law enforcement deals with, I don't speak to the larger societal issues, but the one thing the law enforcement deals with is in parts of our culture, there's entire industries that are built up around narcotics, illicit contraband, and that kind of thing. In the absence of civil courts, for example, for violations of contracts, non-payment of debts, there's been vendetta. There's been people take matters into their own hands and solve problems at that level. To some extent, that's what we're dealing with as well. It isn't just the gun violence as such. The gun violence is a symptom of there not being another way of resolving differences. Now, there's a larger societal component to that, obviously, that I'm not competent to speak to, but the part that I am competent to speak to is that portion of it where there isn't a legitimate, agreed-upon contract resolution, and so that tends to spill over into violence. That is a very large portion of what law enforcement deals with. I can attest to that.
Okay. Ellie, do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, I want to make a comment to that, and that's it. We were having a couple of conversations around this topic before we gathered together while we were registering. And a big portion of what's going on is that we become surprised when we see, the folks, especially young people, become criminalized. In that young folks, and especially in our public school systems that fall out of the mainstream, become increasingly marginated. And these folks are eventually abandoned for illegitimate economies. There's no other way to get along. And they're at risk for becoming criminalized. They go from school to prison systems. Once they actually hit the prison systems, there's scant attention paid to what we call restorative justice. A lot of these young people are simply put in cells, put away, and come out the worse are off and more marginated. Now you've created an individual that will be part of a violent culture because they have had no other experience and no other options presented to them. Beyond that, I think as relates to mental health, and I'm speaking from the standpoint of an emergency physician that got involved with public policy out of necessity. A lot of the initiatives that end up happening now and especially in the last more like decade or so in public health, and I'm a little older than you, so I feel like I have a little leeway to say this, come from the fact that we were left there with patients, working in inner cities, taking care of folks that are harmed by high-powered weapons, and we're the ones that have to have conversations with those families. The doctor, immediately they find the emergency physician, and they say, no, well, you've got to go in and talk to the families. There is no reasonable way to subsume all of the emotionality of a moment when you have to say to someone, listen, your son, daughter, wife, friend, the bullet did too much damage, we were unable to save them. That led to us looking for initiatives like the systems that were started by Dr. Roger Mitchell in Washington, D.C., who's a medical examiner, Rob Gore, who's a good friend up in Kings County in Queens, New York. And the idea that we saw an index case, someone harmed, and we immediately realized that if we reach out to all of the peripheral people involved, there's less likelihood of a retaliation, that these other individuals will become future victims. And so I want to get that out there, that the way in which we deal with young people especially, and the way in which we either attend to their needs and include them into our systems and our economy has everything to do with the outcomes that we see a decade or two down the line.
Okay, thank you so much, Ali. So we just had the conversation about what happens in terms of ambulatory or emergency care. So when this happens, we've moved from kind of what is the problem, but I want to also paint a picture in terms of data, in terms of like how much does this happen that creates this problem. So we've identified that it is a problem. Can someone speak to how much we know about how much of a problem it is? Ari?
Sure. So in public health, we talk about upstream factors and risk factors for, in this case, gun violence. And there's a lot of research to show unaddressed trauma, structural inequities, racism, all these things factor into leading people to engaging in gun violence. So without addressing those structural elements, at the same time passing policies to control guns and especially the illegal flow of guns into impacted communities, we can't, we're not going to adequately tackle this issue, right? So, so in talking about Maryland, in Baltimore City, about 300 individuals are killed by firearm every year, and we can pass policies here in Annapolis that are gonna help, but we also have to be addressing those upstream factors. And there's also a lot of great programs to do community outreach to people who are at elevated risk for violence and provide social supports and wraparound supports for them. And all that stuff is part of gun violence prevention, and it needs to be talked about in the spaces here and in the gun violence prevention community.
Thank you. And you will see, I want you all to know that in subsequent panels, we're going to be having a deeper conversation about the community level impact, which is a huge part of this, as well as policy and advocacy. This panel is essentially a gun violence 101, which is going to it takes a look at the entire thing and sets the stage for our conversation. So we've gone from why, we've talked about some causes, we've talked about prevalence, we've talked about the impact in terms of the medical and ambulatory impact. So let's talk about enforcement a little bit. And I know we talked about the problem. Let's talk about the actual physicality of the gun and those who are using those. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. So how ATF as an agency is enforcing gun violence. So our primary mission over the years, really the last 5 years, has changed on how we are enforcing gun violence. We have turned to more of intel-led policing. We typically, the agency would react to a lot of things, and our investigations would be started by reacting to things that happen. We still do that. It's probably on a much lower level than on things where we know particular people, particular areas that we are specifically addressing to combat the gun violence. As far as our intel-led policing, we have a system that we've always had, ATF has always had the jurisdiction over. It's called the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network System. It's called NIBIN as we refer to it, which is typically the easiest way to explain that is the system will take a fingerprint of a cartridge casing. So in a shooting that occurs, I will use Baltimore City, since we're talking about the violence specifically in Baltimore City has come up. We will recover those cartridge casings, enter it into the NIBIN system. It'll take a fingerprint of that casing, and then we're able to compare one crime to another crime. And utilizing that system, that has been able to allow us to drill down on not only specific areas where the shootings are occurring more often, but to drill down specifically on the people that are committing these crimes. So looking at this from an intel-led perspective, we're able to then gather all information from every database, from every system that we have access to be able to determine the best way to investigate those specific individuals that are committing the crimes. Since using this system, and really, like I said, this system we've had since the 90s, it was just one of those things that we didn't use to our advantage. Funding was always a concern with it. And now we have really drilled down. Congress has given us the money to be able to utilize the system the way that we need to utilize it. And it is being utilized nationwide across the country to be able to specifically find, as we refer to it, the trigger pullers. Because it's those trigger pullers, if they walk out the door with a gun in their pocket, they're going to be the ones, they're walking out the door with the intent to use that gun. Especially in an environment, as has been discussed already, an environment that they may live in.
Thank you. So Dr. Gomez kind of touched on why people own guns. At the very beginning, you touched on that. So we know that people own guns. We kind of know why people own guns for, for protection and other things. So this is a deeper dive really quickly, but who should be excluded from gun ownership? Gun ownership. So who do you think should be excluded from gun ownership, or should everyone own a gun?
I just want to remind you that I am here, that I am here representing ATF. So you're not going to get a direct answer from me. I'm going to be very honest with you. As far as, gun ownership. What I will tell you about gun ownership is there's a process, right? And everyone has a right to go through the process through ATF. We regulate the firearms industry. Individuals are required when they go in to purchase a firearm to fill out what's called a Form 4473. And then their information is ran through the FBI National Criminal Instant Check System, the NICS system, to determine whether or not they are eligible to possess a firearm. And then each individual state has their own individual state laws as far as being able to possess a firearm, be it a long gun or a handgun. So if that individual is able to go through that process and possess a firearm, then they have a right to have that firearm.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, I meant to do this at the beginning, and this is out of respect for all of us as human beings and our mental health, is to remember that some of these things can be traumatizing or triggering to people. So if it does elicit any level of trauma, we do apologize for that, and we are attempting to be mindful of that. So if at any time something does, please make note of it and let me know or let someone know. So thank you all because some of these subject matters can be pretty heavy. So as we move on, so we talked about, we didn't fall or move right to gun control, but that question was to talk about how do we regulate gun ownership, because we know people own guns. And I want to allow the rest of you all to also, I want to ask you if you can, so that everyone gets an opportunity to keep it brief for all of us as well.
Yeah,
So, Chief
before
Herman.
we leave the intelligence-led a portion of this, I just want to say that every police department in the state of Maryland, and probably everyone throughout the nation, we all supply all of our information that we get from recovered handguns, from recovered shell casings, recovered ballistics to the ATF. And it isn't just a matter of solving a specific case. It's a matter of finding straw purchases, federal firearms dealers that are up to no good, that kind of thing. And they've been instrumental in helping us stem the flow of illegal guns coming in and people that are not supposed to have handguns and firearms from having them. So that's been instrumental in stopping a lot of this.
Okay, so while we're in the excuse me, law enforcement and enforcement area, I want to ask the question about the prohibition against computerizing the National Gun Registry. And do you all think it should be reversed? And the reason why is because the belief is that it allows law enforcement agency to efficiently and holistically kind of look at criminal gun activity. So the question is about the computerizing of the National Gun Registry for anyone who knows about that. Politically, if you don't want to speak on it, you don't have to.
I mean, I don't know a ton about, having a national gun registry. What I will say, I think, is having a national gun registry is going to encompass not necessarily, the little bit I do know about it, not necessarily the violent individuals or the prohibited individuals that should not have those firearms. And I think that's where politically things get, there's some things there. But what I will say is the ATF uses a system called the E-Trace system. So anytime there is a firearm that is recovered, our state and local partners submit the information to the ATF National Tracing Center, which is out in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And the information from that firearm is traced through the system back to the firearms dealer that the firearm was purchased from to determine the first purchaser from that firearm. Okay. Another part of ATF's mission is making sure that we're following back to the trail of that gun from the first purchaser. Obviously, we know that prior to it being recovered on the street, it could have changed hands many times over and over. But that's where we work with our state and local partners to try to identify those individuals as to how one person would have gotten that gun from another.
Thank you.
Quick comment.
Yes.
With regard to just the number of weapons, because it hasn't been said yet. Ridiculous marketing like guns don't kill people, people kill people, and all of that aside, there's a direct correlation between the number of weapons and the number of deaths. I see suicide attempts all of the time. I don't see gun suicide attempts and treat them to recovery because they're lethal and the injury is irreversible. So when I get a patient in the emergency department, and this has been going on for 20 years plus that I've been in this profession, I don't care who it is. There are multiple victims. I don't care if that kid was marginalized and then became a perpetrator and then got shot in the midst of an action. I care that all of the harm is happening. That's why I got involved in policy. So just to put that out there quickly, that there's this absolute well-known database with regard to number of weapons and number of deaths.
All right, so I want to thank you. So Chris Rock once made a comment. Do you all know Chris Rock? Right. So Chris Rock once made a comment, and he said that it's not gun control, rather it's bullet control that should be taken into account. Do you think there's any validity to that statement? And can we talk about not just the handgun or the guns, but talk about the control aspect of how do we help prevent or move towards the prevention part of this?
So one thing I wanted to say with control and with the question you asked earlier, we have a lot of domestic violence, and a lot of these people are licensed to have guns. So we also need to have a system where we can check as far as the mental health, the history, what they've been through, because some of them who are licensed to have guns shouldn't have guns. You have the young kids, they have them in their rooms, they're making guns, doing all kind of things, the parents are not checking on them. In addition to that, with the gun violence, with the kids having the guns, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I was reading. Um,
Gun violence.
yeah, gun violence and having the guns. Oh, so also too, what was mentioned, we had a debate party last night, debate watch party, and one of the things that was mentioned that made a lot of sense is just like we have to have a driver's license, and we have to have all these things by the time we're 21 to drink and all this stuff. Why not make it so that they have to have certain criteria set to have gun permits to be able to do that? So I think that's a big issue, and that's a way to be able to control as well.
Okay, so I want to thank you very much for that. And I want to move a little bit towards what I know everyone is on the edge of their seats about, which is once we identify some of the causes, we identify some of the barriers, such as registry, such as being able to identify, those who have guns, who may have a criminal background. But let's talk about mental health. So as we have this conversation, and it's often talked about, but how does mental health enter into our conversation about gun violence? Anyone who can speak on it, and anyone who has any type of data or understands what's going on in that conversation. All right.
Yeah, thank you. We often hear a lot of these tragedies framed around mental health, and the media tends to play that up. The reality is mental health is not a strong predictor or risk factor for gun violence. And so it's important to not stigmatize people who have mental illness, and instead we need to focus on behavioral risk factors, right? So like, what did someone do? So we heard here about people who are domestic abusers. So those people should be prohibited from accessing a firearm because those individuals are at heightened risk for firearm violence. That's one thing that we really need to, I think the NRA likes to play up this point, like, oh, we just need mental health. And the reality is that's just not going to solve the problem, and it's going to stigmatize a lot of people who are suffering from mental illness who are actually at elevated risk for self-harm, but not for harming others. Yeah.
All right, so thank you. Leah?
Just like to piggyback on that to elevate the importance of understanding trauma in understanding and addressing gun violence, and knowing that it's not a matter of individual decisions, but it's a systemic and compounding problem that is the result of much larger social forces, not having access to education, not having access to social support, being excluded from the legal economy in many ways. And what we know from our research, looking at people who carry guns in Chicago and asking them, why do you carry guns? What does this mean to you? It's because they don't feel safe. They feel like having a gun is necessary to defend themselves and keep themselves safe, because the larger systems for public safety they don't feel supported, and they don't feel like they're working for them. So asking those questions and understanding these systemic forces that lead to widespread trauma, I think, is another important part.
So you touched on something really good, Leah, and that was public safety. And I know a lot of your research and a lot of the work that you've been doing is around public safety. So let's move to some solutions around that area. Let's talk about how we can both support and utilize those agencies who work in the area of public safety, but also how we can galvanize and get communities and impacted people to engage in this conversation and help us with solutions, because actually it's all of the things you all just talked about. Anyone want to speak on that?
I'm sorry. So one quick thing I'll say that we do. Black Women for Positive Change, we go directly into the communities and we work with young people because, like I mentioned before, we want to change the culture of violence. We have several films that we produce. One is called On Second Thought, and another one is called Drop. And we bring in these young people along with our community leaders, our politicians, local law enforcement, and we sit with the young people and we watch this film. And then we have the producer and the stars come in and we have a conversation. We have specific questions that we talk to them about, but we also let them be engaged, because what we're hearing from the young people that we're not listening to them. and that we're not engaging them, and we keep trying to tell them what to do. And then you find that after they watch the movie, like our movie On Second Thought, it talks about these young athletes, and they get this young girl pregnant. And anyone can go onto our website on Black Women for Positive Change, and you can watch these movies free. We give them out to the community centers, the PALS centers, and all of that great stuff in the schools. But when they see this movie, it talks about this young guy who actually gets a young girl pregnant, and then he gets another girl pregnant, and then they get together and conspire that they're going to kill this girl, get rid of her. So it also talks to them about the consequences of your action and how you should change your mind. And then talks about being dropping out of high school, getting into the wrong lifestyle, and doing things that you shouldn't do, drugs and all this stuff. So I think when we say we're trying to change the mindset and the culture of violence, we want them to see this and then talk to them and listen to them on how we can redirect their anger, how we can talk about conflict resolution. And we talk about domestic violence and how it is looked at and how young men and young women treat one another. So if you go directly and talk to them, and that's what we're doing, we're hitting them from the inside, from the community, trying to change the way they look at things.
Right. So, thank you. When we say they, because we always talk about perpetrators and who is they? Can someone define what we mean by they?
Can I speak just briefly to that before we get law enforcement to tell us who as they experience them? As I experience them, I've worked at critical access hospitals, which is rural area hospitals, where a lot of victims of violence and perpetrators of violence are folks from trailer parks, which is a completely different economic segregation than we have as a result of redlining. And so there's ample evidence that it's all members of our society, all types of people, all types of backgrounds that are outside the normal economy. Whether we're talking methamphetamine in the trailer park community or heroin and cocaine in redline districts, we need to desegregate our societies.
So again, and thank you very much, Dr. Gomez. I want to ask also, looping back to the they. So it may sound coded, but I'm saying they as in when we speak about what is going on in the area of gun violence, can someone paint a picture as to kind of what we're dealing with in terms of actual individuals, like what we're seeing?
So I agree with Dr. Gomez. You can't, it's really hard to paint who the they is because looking at it from a nationwide standpoint, it's all different types of communities. It's all different types of crimes. It's different types of drugs that are involved that are fueling the violence and fueling gun violence. But what I did want to go into is how law enforcement is actually working with the community to try to get them to help us because we need their help just as much as they're looking for law enforcement to keep them safe and protect them. The communities are the ones that know who the theys are, the individuals that are out there using the guns, dealing the drugs, creating the violence within their community. So speaking locally within Maryland, specifically Baltimore City, ATF along with the U.S. Attorney's Office and Baltimore PD just piloted a billboard program for Stop the Violence in Baltimore City where we are offering rewards to people that come forward with information related to violent crime that's occurring within their communities. Wanted individuals within their communities, and those individuals that they know that are dealing drugs and using guns that are creating the environment that these individuals are living in.
Thank you. I want to do a time check. We'll have about 5 more minutes of this portion of it, and then we're going to open it up to our audience for questions. Chief Herman?
The only thing I would add to that excellent description is that I don't think it's wise, or in any case even possible, to start with the they and then disseminate and then slice it and dice it from there. I think what needs to be done is to recognize that this is a systemic issue that has multiple causes, and that the solution for one is not the solution for the other. So, insofar as I identified, I believe correctly, that there's an illicit economy that has its own enforcement mechanism, the solution for that is quite separate and distinct from the proper solution for another group of problems, which would be mental health, and another group of problems, which would be domestic violence, and another group. So you see, that it's a fool's errand, really, to try to identify a group of people. It has no predictive power that this group of people is going to commit. It doesn't work like that. It's I think it has to be the discrete solutions have to be tailored to the particular problem.
Thank you. I wanna ask a question that kept coming up, and I heard it in kind of subtext, which is the intersection between the criminal justice system and gun violence. So how do they intersect? How do they affect one another? Can anyone speak to that? It can be Leah. It can be.
I can
Ari.
very briefly
Okay, thank
just confine myself to the part that I started out with, which is to say, the portion of the rational actor who is just a bad person who makes bad decisions in life because they, for whatever reason, that's where I think law enforcement is at its strongest. I think that's where we're at our best. I think when we start talking about these other issues, I think we do start to attenuate our effectiveness, and I think we need to bring other things to bear on those issues.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah, what I would add is, of course, there's a huge intersection, and I would just add 2 points. One is that we know that the criminal justice system is generally our primary response to gun violence, but we know that is just simply not enough. We don't have the tools within the criminal justice system that are needed to really address both the root causes of violence and then the repairing the harm after it's committed. And the second one is that the criminal justice system is often used as the default is sort of, well, we'll just ramp up the penalties and it will be a deterrent. And we just know that because of the connections between violence and much larger systemic issues that go far beyond the criminal justice system, that also can't be where the discussion ends. And so I think there are really creative, and the panelists have talked about some really creative ways that the criminal justice system and communities can work together, but it just simply must go farther than that.
Thank you all very much. I wanna do a speed round. Unfortunately, there's no monetary prize involved in this, but I want you to give me one or two words to this question, and we're gonna go down the line. What can we do to reduce gun violence? What can we do? Doesn't have to be one or two words, maybe one or two sentences. So whoever would like to begin first, we can either go down the line, or you can, and then we'll move into our Q&A. What can be done to reduce gun violence?
At the risk of being redundant, I honestly feel like our institutions have to be informed by the way in which our society is laid out. You can't take people and marginalize them from the point at which they no longer conform to what you'd expect in the educational system. And those young people, regardless of their race or background, if you marginalize them, you're going to create people that are going to end up expressing a violent act. And if on top of that they have access to lethal weapons like guns, they're not going to punch you, and you're going to end up with this problem.
Thank you. Now, do not follow Dr. Gomez's example. You all do a quarter of that.
Ditto. Ditto to Dr. Gomez. I am also a retired federal investigation for 16 years. I work for U.S. Customs and ICE. So I have a lot to say on this, but I'm letting the professionals who are in it now handle it. I work with all of their agencies. I like to say that we need community policing. You need to get to know your community, get to know the people. There are different ways when we talk about de-escalation. There are ways that people treat different individuals. Like, for example, you had someone who shot 19 people. and then they were taken into custody in handcuffs and got to get something to eat. And then you have someone who you think they have a telephone, or you think something's going on and you shoot them 30, 40 times. So we also need to have people to get to be in the communities and know who they're dealing with.
Thank you very much.
Two things. One is I think policymakers and practitioners need to do some deep listening and co-collaboration with communities that are most impacted by gun violence. And the second one is I think we need an increased focus on healing from trauma.
Understanding that I'm confining myself to the constraints of the question and just to criminal justice, reducing recidivism, and one of the ways is increasing sentencing.
We need a comprehensive approach, so we need to tackle it from so many different angles. So it's not just criminal justice, it's not just public health. We all need to work together to both tackle it from the policy side, but also from the community side.
From the federal perspective, I would say our partnerships with our state and local agencies, because they are the ones that are on the streets each and every day to know exactly what is going on within the communities, and working very closely with them to combat that violence that's occurring and the individuals that are causing it.
All right. Thank you very much. Can we give them a round of applause? Also, because these were not easy questions, and they all answered them just completely succinctly and amazingly. So thank you. And now we're going to begin our audience questions, which is the best part of this particular panel, because we get to hear from those who are impacted and are here. So our first question is going to come from, can you please, when you stand up, if you feel the need to state your name so we know who's here. Here, you can use this one, and then just pass that one.
Thank you, and thank you. I'm sorry? Yeah, okay, I'm okay. Thank you for convening this meeting. I'm Linda Eggbeer, and my question is, how do we keep the gun violence that is occurring in marginalized communities, regardless of where they are and who they involve, as visible for policymakers in the U.S. as mass shootings?
Yeah, now it's green. All right, sorry. So that's an incredibly important question, and I'm pretty frustrated by the fact that we don't have a lobby for typical day-to-day crime in inner cities or in marginalized communities. But that's the problem. That every time one of these mass shootings happens, the NRA gears up its marketing, and those folks are putting money in the pockets of people that are then passing legislation. And so that's where we're really at. We as a community and an interested community have to be advocates in a strong manner, because we're up against that type of political force and economic force.
So I'm going to be raw with you right now. I work with a lot of young people. Oh, in short, I have a couple of rental properties in Baltimore City. And when we talk to young people and different individuals, I know when something happens in my neighborhood, the law enforcement is there within a few seconds, a couple of minutes. There have been instances that happen in the communities where I have rental properties, and my tenants call me, and it may take the police officer 20, 30, 40 minutes to get there. So what the young people are saying, first of all, they're scared to call the police because they don't know if they're going to be the ones to get shot, or they don't know what's going to happen. And then secondly, they feel like law enforcement is allowing them to kill each other and allowing things to happen in their communities. So that's what I'm getting straight from the individuals who live in these underserved communities.
We'll go ahead and go to the next question.
Good morning. My name is Carlos Wallace, and I'm a member of the ACT Gun Violence Reduction Team and also First Christian Community Church. My question is, what are the gun manufacturers doing to implement safety, such as biotechnical safety devices, and what are the national requirements in place to to encourage gun manufacturers to move forward with that particular devices?
So the gun manufacturers, there are specific requirements under federal law that they have as far as us being able to identify exactly what type of firearm they're actually manufacturing. So they go through the process. They have to submit to ATF what types of firearms they're producing and they're making, and they have to show that those markings are on that firearm so that it is, if it is used in a crime, that we have a way of identifying it. And that while we're keeping records within the licensees, that we're able to identify that the licensees actually purchase those firearms from manufacturers. But as far as safety is concerned, there's individual state laws on whether a firearm should be locked by a possessor who it cannot be, who can't have access to it, but there really is nothing that the manufacturer is actually held to as far as besides a safety on the firearm, for a safety lock on the firearm besides safety purposes.
And I wanted to add that in our prevention panel as well, one of the key questions for that panel is technology. So looking at what emerging technology is going to allow us to do exactly what you're talking about. And I believe that technology may drive manufacturers to have to abide by a different set of standards. But
James Spearman with the Caucus of African American Leaders. My question is this. When it was said that there is no correlation in data between gun violence and mental health, how do you take into account all the mass shootings that are affecting our society all over the country?
Yeah, good question. So when we're talking about mental illness, there's millions of Americans who suffer with mental illness every day. That does not put them at heightened risk for interpersonal firearm violence, right? But if you looked at the gun violence that's attributable directly to mental illness, it's about 4% of gun violence. So a very small portion of gun violence is actually attributable to mental illness. So when we blame and stigmatize a group who's already stigmatized in our society, it's really problematic, and it's not going to address the 96% of firearm deaths or firearm homicides. So when we talk about mental health, obviously trauma is a component, and trauma definitely feeds into unaddressed trauma or lack of services for trauma. That is different than mental illness. So I guess what I meant was people who are suffering with mental illness are not at a heightened risk. Yeah. Yep. So. Yep.
Thank you. I think this is the only panel that seems to address guns in and of themselves. This is about gun violence. So let me ask this very broad question, and this is stemming from that word vexing. Maybe this is a very vexing question, and I address it to ATF, basically. Can you explain our per capita gun ownership at 120.5 per 100? Mathematically, that doesn't make sense, but it is 120.5 per 100 per, say, a country like Israel, which is, a war anxious country of only 6.7 per 100. And the second part of that question is, for all of you, do you equate this? It's a basic question, and it's a vexing question, and I think we all have to agree with this. Do you believe this per capita is proportional to our number of gun violence incidents?
So let me understand your question first. So you're saying that's the number of guns per 100?
Yes. Why do we own so many guns in the United States of America?
There's lawful owners. I can't answer that question more than if there's individuals who own firearms are lawful owners. Just because you're an owner of a firearm doesn't mean that you're actually the user of that firearm.
I actually have two. I have this one and super long one.
That's the chief one.
Yes.
We could add one quick thing to Ellie's question, and that goes back to what I was saying before. If you create a culture in which everyone is afraid of everyone else, and folks are accumulating guns, because it's not everybody that has weapons, but you do find that people that do have weapons don't own one weapon; they'll own a dozen weapons. And they'll be thinking in terms of, well, what if someone comes for me? Well, I'm going to be ready for that. And so it's the fear that's driving this ridiculous accumulation of weapons.
And in addition to that, that fear is real because you've had people who stop because their car was broken down on the road, knock on the door, and they get shot. So you have so many incidents where people get shot because they automatically had a fear. You have some people just have the fear because of the color of your skin, and they're going to automatically shoot at you. So that's the real thing. And they had a big thing on CNN and MSNBC, and they went around and they talked to the people all over the country, and that was their main thing, was just that fear. They want to be able to protect themselves. And sometimes it's just a mental fear.
Quick question. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. This question's for the chief. Sorry. When you mentioned being from an enforcement-only standpoint, however, we've talked about the other root causes and the determinants that create people actions of gun violence. We see pictures of officers like dancing with children and doing the community policing, but then those same officers, when interacting with teens or adults, may not have the same idea. Can you speak to, again, the community policing and potentially having officers who live where they work and getting that relationship with the community so we don't address that fear that was spoken earlier?
I can. Just to clarify, when I'm making the comments about the criminal justice system as such, I meant to be careful about confining my comments just to that aspect of it. I didn't mean to suggest that these other things aren't immensely important. I just felt that my role on a panel here, I'm more competent to speak to that than I am obviously to speak to some of these larger issues. So from my perspective, the community policing component is absolutely essential. There cannot be, and there ought not to be, a separation between my officers and the community that they serve. If there is, then I'm doing something wrong, and it needs to be resolved. There's a lot of mechanisms that we do to try to bridge that gap. Some are effective, some aren't quite so effective. Some work in some communities, not in others. So I can't really answer your question simply, other than in the abstract, I would say absolutely essential. You have to have a police department that serves a community. And what was touched on earlier is the other end of it is true too. A community has to be tasked with the perception that the police are there to serve them. So it's a two-way street. It isn't just I mean, look, we're getting paid. It's our job to reach out. I mean, the community's not being paid. So, I mean, obviously the burden's on us, primarily. That said, it is a two-way street.
Okay, we have just time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to take a little break before the next panel. I would like to introduce somebody who needs no introduction, the Capital Gazette editor, Rick Hudson.
Hi. I was going to start with I'm Rick Hutzel, but I was going to start with I'm Rick Hutzel, but I don't need an introduction. So we spent the last year asking a lot of questions about this, and I'm a professional question asker, so I'm frustrated I only get to ask one. So I was going to ask why there was no gun rights advocate here today. They were a part of this debate, and I understand that they were invited and decided not to participate. So I find myself in the unbelievable situation of asking a question that I think they would ask if they were here. And that is, you said there's no connection, causative connection between mental health and gun violence. I looked at the ATF data for Maryland. The largest single category of individuals had guns not seized but taken by police. You know, there was a crime there, they were stolen, whatever, is over 55. 9% of the population has dementia, age-related dementia. Suicide in most states is the largest single cause of gun violence deaths. I think if you take out what's the number in Baltimore now, 200, 300 a year? I think if you take that out, it's going to put Maryland probably back in the statistical norm. So 2 of the homicides this year in Anne Arundel County have involved individuals who are in programs designed to help youth with emotional and mental illness, disabilities. they aged out of the program, they didn't get any treatment, they were involved in homicides. There is clear anecdotal evidence and some statistical evidence that there is a connection between issues that are broadly defined as mental health and gun violence. It's there on paper. How can you say there's not?
I'm going to take up Ferrari for a quick second before he answers that question. And this is what I'm going to say about that. Rick, we're not saying that completed suicide isn't directly correlated to owning a weapon if you're mentally unstable and you're about to commit suicide. If you have a bottle of Tylenol and you take that bottle and you come into the emergency room, I can save your life. If you shoot yourself in the head, I can't. So yes, that is a direct correlation. But I could have 1,000 psychiatrists available in the community that I take care of, and it still wouldn't change that outcome. They could have care. There's still a certain percentage that will commit suicide, and if they don't have a gun, they won't complete it because they'll bring them to me.
That's what we have to talk about enough. I mean, there is a secondary cause of death listed on death certificate. Gunshot violence, gunshot wound is primary. Dementia or some type of mental is a secondary cause for a lot of suicide. So there is a connection between mental health issues and gun violence.
Right, and I think now we're saying exactly the same thing, which is you're holding a weapon and you want to commit suicide, you're going to end up killing yourself. If you're not, you won't. That's my point.
Okay, so I think when we're talking about interpersonal firearm violence, when we're talking about interpersonal firearm violence versus self-inflicted firearm violence, they're different, right? But if we're talking about suicide, a big component of that is restricting access to lethal means, right? So if someone is suicidal and they have access to a firearm, and they attempt by firearm, they're about 90% likely to die by firearm suicide. If they they try to overdose, it's around 5 to 10% lethality. But there is a component when we're talking about self-suicide. But a lot of times it's like tangentially related to mental health and mental illness because it's related to other factors that, so like substance abuse is a huge contributing factor, and it contributes more so to the likelihood of firearm violence than a diagnosable mental illness. So like, I mean, again, like we can talk about, so we can talk.
Thank you. So I want to thank you all, and I'm tasked with keeping us on the right path. So I thank you all very much for your responses to those questions. And I thank you all for your hard-hitting questions. And sometimes, it's not pretty, but we're not having this conversation to be pretty. We're having this conversation to really have dialogue about it. I have one more question, and then we have to wrap up, and it has to be fast. Mr. Jones?
So I've been watching this drug business since the 50s. And it seems to me that there's an awful lot of violence on the part of the police for the people who sell the drugs, but not too much about the people who use the drugs. And I'm going to put that in modern language. The people who sell the drugs and the people who have a health issue. The problem that I have with that is that the police dealing with the sellers has exacerbated the problem in the communities where people can only make a living selling.
I'll reframe the question. How are we dealing with criminalizing activities that should be framed as either a public health issue or a issue or problem with individual behavior, instead of making a character judgment or judgment or criminalizing them? How are we dealing with that? And I really want to move. I'm not forcing you to answer that question, but we need to move to our closing piece so that we can honor time. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I'll just I'll just say something real quick. There are some laws that they're working on as far as those who are in jail now for small doses of marijuana, and now that we have the dispensaries where people are making a lot of money off of it. So they are trying to change some of those laws, and with the disparities that we had with crack cocaine and powder cocaine. So they are there is some legislation out there, and they are working on some laws.
Thank you. And this is a commercial. I'm going to constantly do commercials about upcoming panels. So one of the subject matters on our community impact one is the war on drugs, and how the war on drugs, which is what I think you're touching on, Mr. Jones, is and the impact that it has in the gun violence, criminalization world. So I thank you all for being on this panel. I will give you. I'm going to time you. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap up, and all of you can simply thank the mayor or thank the city of Annapolis if you want, or you can say a little bit for 30 seconds about wrapping up. Bless you.
Yeah, I've used up my time. Thank you.
Thank you to the mayor and Mr. Williams for inviting me here. I know. And then also I want to say I do have some flyers up here. I implore you to please take a flyer and join us in trying to change the culture of violence, and you can do something in your city and in your hometown or at your school.
I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank Annapolis for hosting this discussion, because I think it is in asking the hard questions and really engaging these topics together that we are really doing the work of solving the problem. So thank you all.
I do feel obligated to answer the gentleman's question directly. I think what you say has weight. I think it is one of the things that our policymakers need to consider is to what extent we've created an economic incentive to violence. It isn't my place to answer that question, but I think it is a legitimate question for us as a society to ask. And of course, thank you to the mayor for putting on it.
I want to thank you for including me in this conversation and for all the great questions. And I hope this leads to some actionable steps to reduce gun violence.
Also, thank you to the mayor, but I also, I just want to encourage you from a law enforcement perspective as well to, as much as it is law enforcement's responsibility to be involved in the communities, the responsibility, as the chief said, is also on the community. So I encourage you, when you're out there in the community, that with those individuals in the community cooperating with us, it helps us do our job.
Thank you all very much, and thank you all.